Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday to you. This is Lana Peterson, one of the facilitators for today for Investigation Creating Inquiry-Based Service Learning Projects. There's my picture. I'm a Professional Development Manager here at National Youth Leadership Council. With me, as well as Marcus Penny, our GSN Communications Associate. He's the producer for the webinar, so he'll be taking all of your questions, needs, and sending you through some documents and links throughout the webinar. So enough about us. This is a map of the U.S., which there may be some international attendees here as well. If you can go up to the top left of your webinar screen, there should be some tools. One looks like an arrow. It's a pointer. If you'll grab that and put it on the state in which you are, and if you're not in any of those states, put it somewhere on the top and share your location through the chat box. All right, we got some East Coast, some Midwest, Arizona, a couple Minnesotas. Awesome. And now if you could also introduce yourself and your role through the chat box based on where you live, what you're doing, why you want to come to this webinar today. We can create a community of learners. I should say we call ourselves webinar facilitators because we see this as a group learning process, not necessarily me infusing you with all of knowledge. So please feel free to jump in, ask questions, answer other people's questions, share your examples. Make sure that your chat is set to send to all participants so everybody can see it. So here at the National Youth Leadership Council, my main role is to give online and in-person trainings as well as oversee the Generator School Network, which we'll talk about later. We have Tony Kaufman, Director of Service Learning and Community Relationships. King of Prussia, PA, welcome. I am an Judy's an education person at the National Park, working with local high schools on service learning project. Welcome, we love our national parks people. Hi there, everyone. This is Tom Wilson, Program Coordinator for the Office of Community University Partnerships and Service Learning at the University of Vermont. Ooh, Vermont, what a beautiful place. Hello, everyone. This is from Sarah, Coordinating Service Learning for Milwaukee Public Schools. Milwaukee Public Schools is a powerhouse for service learning, too, so we love that. Anyone else, feel free to bring it through the chat box. I'm going to keep going with the agenda, but I'll read them off as it comes. So our agenda for today is really to look back at the origins of the IPARD model, why we use this model. Then we're going to look at inquiry as it relates to service learning and education. We're going to do some connections to the service learning standards, and then I'm going to provide some guiding questions and outcomes for the investigation stage. We have some more. Sasha, she's Adolescent Health Coordinator for Communities and Schools South Central Texas. Welcome. Emily is from the Boys and Girls Club of the Northland, Learning Center Coordinator for AmeriCorps Promise Fellow, works with teens to develop leadership programs and a call to action within our community. I am an AmeriCorps Promise Fellow alumni, so I love that you are on here. Whoop. All right. So next I want to share, based on what you do and who you are, and since we have such a diverse audience, what is your goal for this webinar so that I, as a facilitator, can help us make sure that your needs are met. And if they're not met through this webinar, or if it requires further documentation, or if I have some resources I can share for you, I will do that afterwards as well. So if you could share what your goal is for attending today. Chris is a humane educator in Arizona, and I work with students of all ages on service learning projects that support animals. Awesome, Chris. I went to ASU as a student, and it is 10 degrees outside of Minnesota, so I wish I was in Arizona. That's my response to you. Anyone else? What is your goal for attending today's webinar? Why did you sign up? What were you hoping to gain from this experience? Sarah says, learn simple, practical strategies for teaching teachers how to use academically rigorous service learning. Awesome. That's always a mouthful, academically rigorous service learning, but that's what we strive for. I'm going to read more as they come through. So to get us all started, just because there might be a wide range of service learning knowledge here, I just want to read NYLC's definition of service learning. Service learning is an approach to teaching and learning in which students use academic knowledge and skills to address genuine community needs. Let's see. Emily says she'd like to develop better service learning programming for our mentors that is interesting, fun, and meaningful. Distinguishing features of inquiry-based service learning projects as opposed to other community-engaged learning opportunities. That was Tom. Tony says the goal is to have better core knowledge to share with participating students. Absolutely. Mary says learning to develop projects with elementary students. All right, so I'm going to start with a mistake that I see often and why we've developed the academically rigorous service learning framework. A lot of people that I work with, I see them first starting with a social justice issue or a service opportunity. We have an idea in mind, and then as educators, we quickly go to all the amazing different activities that we can do to make this service learning fun and interesting. And then we think, oh, yep, we got to tie it back to our outcomes and our goals, whether those are academic or civic. And so we tie it back to math. We try to find ways to tie it together. But oftentimes, these connections going backwards like that, they could be really weak. And so students don't actually come out with the outcomes that we intend for them to have at the end of their service learning project. And this is why sometimes service learning can get a bad rap and not seem very academically rigorous, because we're not starting with those academic goals. The next thing that some people try to do is use the service learning standards for quality practice to plan their whole unit. These standards were published in 2008, and they are the best practice standards for service learning. So when service learning is at its best, it involves these things. These are practice standards, so the way in which we do things. It's not necessarily outcomes for students. And when trying to use them within isolation to share what you're going to do, it doesn't lead from A to Z of a project plan. So, knowing these challenges, we developed academically rigorous service learning process. The first is to identify desired results. What do you want your students to know, do, or believe by the end of the project or unit? These outcomes, like I said, can be character, civic, leadership standards. They can have academic components. They could actually be both. But before we enter this process as educators, we need to identify what it is exactly we want our students to know, be able to do, and believe. From there, we determine acceptable evidence. And when we say this term, we essentially mean what's it going to look like when they get there. So in step 2, you're really focusing on formative or ongoing assessments, you know, exit tickets at the end of the day, conversations, group conversations and reflections together. And then you're also focusing on that summative assessment, which is that big final project that always happens within service learning. And then the third step is the student learning activities, the IPART, which, as I said before, is often people's first thing that they plan as they go into it, but we really want to wait until we have our foundation built. And so this is what we're using the IPART model for. So just to touch on it, this is the self-assessment, what happened after this. This is for teachers to assess what they have done, or educators to assess what they've done. We're not going to focus on that today. We're going to go back, but I just wanted to present the overall plan to you that there is 4 steps. So going back to the IPARD cycle, there's some things to note. So investigation, planning and preparing, action, reflection, and demonstration. And some things I want to point out is it's not a linear process. It's definitely a cyclical. Some service learning projects make it around this cycle several times. So for example, with hunger and homelessness, maybe you do some initial investigation, planning and preparing, and then your first line of action is a direct action. You're going to a homeless shelter and you're serving homeless people that are without homes or do not have access to food. You reflect on that, and then you think, you know what, we want to go a little bit deeper with this. So then you go around the cycle again within that service learning project. You investigate how you can create more of a systemic change. You plan and prepare, let's say, a food drive, right? And you get all of your peers in on it, and you're doing that indirect service. You're creating a system for others to serve. You reflect on what you did, and then you think, I want to go even more systemic with this. So again, you investigate and you write in a letter to a congressperson on how you want more funding for those that do not have a place to live or food to eat. So that is one topic where you could go around several times within this cycle. Another point that I want to show you is that as you see from the colored sections in the middle, the action is only a small piece of the puzzle. So we often hyper-focus on this area when actually service learning is a bigger process that requires learning and reflecting both before and after the service. Speaking of reflection, you'll see that there's a step within the cycle that specifically focuses on reflection. This can be really misleading as reflection happens throughout the process, but it serves as a placeholder for you. These activities you plan for the IPARD cycle will most likely shift and change because one of the service learning standards for quality practice is youth voice. So as an educator that is using a constructivist pedagogy, you're using a problem-based approach to teaching and learning, and you want your youth to be the leaders and you to be the guide on the side versus sage on the stage, you have to know that your students will alter what you have planned in these 5 steps based on their knowledge, and oftentimes not only will they alter, they'll make it better, they'll enhance it. And then a lot of resources talk about IPARD as an essential component, but fail to really explain what that steps mean. You may have gone on the internet and found some service learning program documentation or suggestions, and they talk about IPARD, but when they talk about investigation or planning and preparing, they maybe give like one little sentence, which isn't very helpful. So that is kind of the IPARD model in total. And if you do have any questions or any comments or things you want to bring up as we're going through this process, please send them to the chat box at any time, and we'll make sure to get them answered as we go along or turn them into conversations amongst the group. So now, focusing on investigation, so we're zooming in on that first step, I wanted to showcase a fun little quote that I actually found on Pinterest, but Marcus just sent through a link to a website that I thought explained the inquiry process very well. I didn't think I could do it any better myself. And so I just want to read part of it to you, that it's crucial to recognize that inquiry-based teaching should not be viewed as a technique or instructional practice or method used to teach a subject. Rather, inquiry starts with teachers as engaged learners and researchers with the foundational belief that the topics they teach are rich, living, and generous places of wonder and exploration. Inquiry is not merely having students do projects, but rather strives to nurture a deep discipline-based way of thinking and doing with students. As an entry point, inquiry involves learners tackling real-world questions, issues, and controversies, developing questioning, research, and communication skills, solving problems or creating solutions, collaborating within and beyond the classroom, developing deep understanding of content knowledge, and participating in the public creation and improvement of ideas and knowledge. I thought that was a beautiful way to introduce inquiry and what that means, and it perfectly aligns with what a student would do within service learning. But as educators, we must create an environment that supports inquiry. It must be an inquiry-based environment, which changes the way that we approach teaching and learning in our setting. So one strategy to support this is having a well-designed essential question be essential questions, this is really happens in the first step when we identify our desired results. And the driving theorist on this is Grant Wiggins, where Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe created the backwards design model, which is what our service learning planning process is based around. But Grant Wiggins defines essential within questions, important questions that recur throughout one's life. Such questions are broad in scope and timeless by nature. They are perpetually arguable. What is justice? Is art a matter of taste or principles? How far should we tamper with our own biology and chemistry? Is science compatible with religion? Is an author's view privileged in determining the meaning of a text? We may arrive at or be helped to grasp understandings for these questions, but we soon learn that the answers to them are invariable provisional. So really, they're just going to keep happening throughout students' lives. A good essential question causes genuine and relevant inquiry into the big ideas and core content. It provokes that deep thought, lively discussion, and sustained inquiry, and new understanding as well as more questions. It requires students to consider alternatives, weigh evidence, support their ideas, and justify their actions. It stimulates vital, ongoing rethinking of big ideas, assumptions, and prior lessons. It sparks meaningful connections with prior learning and personal experiences, and it naturally recurs, creating opportunities for transfer to other situations and subjects. And Marcus also sent that link from, if you want to read more about Grant Wiggins' perspective on creating essential questions, or if you want to better, add to the quality of your essential questions, just look through the chat box. There's a question from Chris. Will we get a copy of this presentation or key points? And this presentation will be recorded and posted on the GSN. Within a day or two, you'll all get a link to where you can find this presentation on the GSN so you can watch it as well. Thanks, that's a great question. So now that we've kind of taken a look at inquiry, you might want to, let's take a moment and do a little self-reflection through the chat box. How do you, as an educator, or if you don't work directly with students, how, with the teachers that you work with, how do you create an environment of inquiry? What's happening within your settings to really push students to become investigators, whether it's within the service learning focus or not, something else? How are you making students inquiry-based? You can send that to the chat box. Make sure it goes to all participants. Focusing on big ideas, core content, deep thought, lively discussion, considering the alternatives, weigh evidence, vital ongoing thinking, looking at assumptions, meaningful connections to prior learning, creating opportunities for transfer. Are there any of these things that are happening within your settings that you'd be willing to share? Sarah says, one small thing I do is encourage teachers and students to make sure they are getting multiple diverse perspectives on any question. Absolutely, and that plays into the service learning standard diversity, making sure that you see things from all sides, and it's not just that surface level issue that they're dealing with, but really that most of these issues that go unsolved have multiple perspectives of it, and that's why it's not so easy to create a solution for them. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing. Anyone else want to share one way that they create an inquiry-based environment within their school or their program? I'm going to keep going, but please send them through. I will stop when others come through the chat box. You may still be typing. So to relate this all back to the K-12 service learning standards and the IPARD model, a lot of times I go to presentations and all these different concepts or program guides are introduced, but they don't necessarily explain how they go together, and so I want to clearly articulate how these two elements go together, the I-PART and the ingredients. And I call it the service learning souffle. So this was an idea brought by Jim Toole, who's a very amazing and knowledgeable service learning trainer and researcher, starting with the ingredients. Those standards are the ingredients, and then the recipe is the I-PART model. So there's not a one-to-one correlation between any certain standard and where it lands within the inquiry cycle, but they can show up all along, as well as there's a million ways to bake a cake. Some people could add the flour first or add the flour last. It doesn't matter as long as, you know, the flour is there per se, unless you're making a gluten-free cake. So from Chris, he said, in our case, we outline the state of conditions in our community to lay a foundation. Students quickly see the issues. We then, over days, move to causes and contributing factors, but always within an undercurrent of empathy-driven discussions. When we get to the time of solution building, their empathy is full of gear and transforms into action. They feel empowered. That's a really beautiful way to say that. Students are often looked at as really apathetic, but we know from the research on this generation that's not actually true. In fact, they have a lot of anxieties when it relates to their community, rather than other generations before them. And it's our job as educators to help them use their knowledge and skills and talents to make a difference within this world. So I love the way that you stated that, Chris. So I'm going to go through and give some examples of ways that these standards can show up within the investigation portion of the I-PART cycle. So first I'll begin with meaningful service. Main component of meaningful service is to ensure that service is age appropriate and personally relevant. If it's not relevant or the students cannot see the relevance, their interest and investigation may fall short. Also, if you explore a social justice issue on the service level, like I said, you may easily get to that answer versus using that driving question to push you throughout the whole project. And they'll ultimately face these questions throughout their lives. The next one is linked to curriculum. There are lots of opportunities to integrate your academic and civic outcomes through investigation. To investigate, it'll take research, interaction with others, including the community, reading, writing, teamwork, and then some of these activities might require sub-skills in order to complete it. So you want a student to do a speech, but before they get to do that speech, you need to break down the skills and knowledge that someone would need to have in order to do a speech or to do a survey. It's not just so easy that students will complete a survey, but what does that mean and what do they have to know to be able to do that with success? Next is reflection. And in the investigation part, this really focuses on preflection, the reflection before anything happens. And they really document the preconceptions that they approach the project with. And it may help them compare how they have grown and learned by comparing their preconceptions to their newfound knowledge at the end of the project. The next is diversity. So when investigating the issue, it's important to see the issue from all perspectives, just like Sarah just said, in order to create a thoughtful plan of action. Take the time to see all the sides of the story in the investigation. And one great way to do that is to break up the students and have them investigate different perspectives and then come together and do a debate so that everybody can understand where the people that they're aligned with come from. The next is youth voice. And then coming into the I-PART model does not mean that you as an educator cannot have a plan for how, what, where, when, etc. related to the service learning project. In fact, if your students are even younger, you should have a very strong idea. Or if your students have never gone about a service learning project before, this could be a very new concept. And it doesn't mean that you have to come in and not have any plan and students get to plan the whole thing, but it is important that if you have a plan coming in, that you hook them in some way, shape, or form. As I said before, students are very empathetic. If you provide them with a structure or somebody, let's say you want to focus on children's cancer and you bring in a mother who lost their daughter or son to cancer, they're going to feel for that person. They're going to understand the strife that they're going through, and they will jump to action if you allow them to. But you do have to take the time to hook them and give them ownership over the project and make them feel like they have input within the process. The next piece is partnerships. There's most likely someone in your community who also cares or has investigated this issue. Use them and their knowledge. Visit them or have them visit you, either in person or online. Connect students with partners at the beginning to help them connect throughout the project. The next one is progress monitoring. By the end of investigating, you should have a clear vision of what issues students hope to address, either in their local or global community. So that's really that baseline. And then last is duration and intensity. The service learning process begins at the initial introduction of the idea to students and lasts until the final demonstration. Do not rush the investigation stage. It is fruitful and necessary for students to address this issue completely. So using these standards, linked to curriculum, meaningful service, reflection, youth voice, partnerships, duration, intensity, progress monitoring, what do you think you could improve within your current investigation stage? Looking at those standards, which one is lacking with the way that you're approaching investigation and inquiry with your students currently? And do you have any idea of how you can improve it, or do you have a question that you'd like us all to contribute to? So send that through the chat box. I'll give you a little bit of time to type that up, but I would like to hear from most people on the webinar on what standard could be improved within the investigation process that you lead. Tony, we see that you wrote in Rachel's challenge. If you want to take the time to expand on what you mean, we think you're referring to a national nonprofit, but if you can share what that has done for your practice or how you've utilized Rachel's challenge or any resources or URLs you want to share, we would love to learn more about it. Which standard do you think could be improved within the investigation process at your program or school? Sarah says, I really like the idea to have students reflect on any preconceptions they have before investigation. Absolutely, that ties both to actually reflection and diversity if you look at the indicators for the standards. Ignorance is a powerful thing, and this is a really beautiful way to make students more aware of what's happening in their community versus maybe what they've heard on the bus or at home or through the television. But it's important for them to realize how far they've come and maybe apply that they could possibly have some preconceptions in other areas that they could get beyond. Anyone else see one of the standards that they think could be improved within the investigation component of their service learning project? All right, Alicia says, oh, I hope I'm spelling your name or pronouncing your name right, reflection as well. I think that in addition to beforehand and in culmination, we also need to provide structure and time for our students to reflect throughout, yes. And there is actually, if you go onto the Generator School Network, which we will provide a link, we have a topic on reflection and some strategies that you can use reflection within. A lot of people use reflection throughout through journals. Some people are using e-portfolios to collect the documents and thoughts of their students as they go about it. Throughout, you could use, like I said, exit slips, or they share with you classroom discussions. Sometimes reflection can serve multiple purposes as well, so you may be reflecting as well as assessing at the same time. And so it kind of infuses everything together, but really thinking as reflection as that bridge between experience and knowledge, so gaining that knowledge as well. So I'm going to let the other ones, Melissa, in my class we did not link it to the curriculum very well or evaluate state standards with the class. So I would like to focus on that next time. I was surprised at the empathy, voice, and action that my students were excited to take. It is amazing what they can do when given the freedom. Absolutely. And it takes a certain educator to be willing to give them that freedom as well. And it's that balance sometimes of really ensuring that you've given them that space. One piece that's important from the very beginning would be to hand out a rubric on what you need to see as an educator and allowing them that freedom to choose how they want to present that to you. Do they want to do it through a PowerPoint? Do they want to give a speech? Do they want to give a performance? Or could you give a few of them a suggestion on what you need to see in order to move forward with the academic piece? So attached are some guiding questions. Marcus is actually going to send through a document as well where some of these came from. It's called the SLAP, the Service Learning Action Plan, and this could be some questions that you would bring your students through. You can download it and write on it, do whatever you want. You can take the questions that make sense to you and skip the others. But what community will you be serving? The idea of community is a flexible term, whether it's world, nation, local, or within your school, specific population. What community need have you identified as a group, and how do you know it's a community need? We see a lot of people doing service projects that are nice, but they definitely do not get to the core issue. And so we will continue to have these problems if we don't start focusing on that core. What further research can you do to prove that this is a community need? Because when you go to community partners or when you start advocating for what you need, it's important to have that evidence behind it, as well as using that evidence to guide your plan. Who are the possible community partners, either individuals or organizations that are also invested in this issue? We talked about that a little bit. But really, instead of creating silos within our communities, we want to make sure that anybody focused on a certain issue is working together so that they could be more strategic and get farther faster. If you as an adult have a prior idea or direction for the project, how will you guide students to care and feel for that invested issue? I remember after the earthquake in Haiti, I read a children's book to a group of students, second graders, I believe. It's called C'est la vie, and it was actually written before the earthquake had ever happened. And so it gave an overview of what orphans actually experience in Haiti. And I read this book, and it was really heartfelt, and it was kind of scary for what it was. And then I explained that they recently also had an earthquake. And all it took was me presenting this idea, and a student raised their hand and said, I want to do something, let's do it. It didn't take a long process to get them invested in the issue. So think about that as you're creating your hook. How will you come to a consensus of one community need? If your students are going different directions or have different ideas, how can you bring them all together? And the opposite question would be, do you need to bring them together? Can you do this from different directions? So the next slide, I want to come up with what are some examples of activities you can do within the investigation stage to guide inquiry within the classroom. What does this look like? I've shared a few of them thus far, but how will students go through the investigation process? And you can send those through the chat box again, or you can go up to the tools, and there's a T tool. You can write directly on the slide if you wish. What are some example activities either you've seen or you've done to guide inquiry within your class, with your students? Tony fill this in while you're all typing. On Rachel's Challenge is a wonderful character building program born from the Columbine incident. When you noted the empathetic nature of students, this is what came to mind. Choosing to be kind to one another and sharing that with the whole community is something that is happening in my town. The students have presented before the town council, Rotary, and have created a float to be in the holiday parade through town. We can't impose something on children that we as adults are not practicing too. We want our entire community to be kinder to one another. That is a beautiful quote, Tony, and it plays into the things I shared about inquiry before. If you would like inquiry to happen in your classroom with your students, if you want to be empathetic, if you want your students to be empathetic, you as an adult need to model that behavior as well. That totally rings true. We'd love to feature, I'll make sure the link, maybe Marcus could get the link and send it through, and then maybe we'll post a video within the topic on Rachel's Challenge as well to ensure that everybody gets to know the information a bit more. Thank you for sharing. Marcus just sent that through. Any example activities of how investigation happens within your school, your program, your course, your district? How are we getting students to research what's happening in the community? Sarah says, put students in small groups. Give each group a variety of documents, photos, data, story, etc. Let each person choose a document to look at. Once they have had time to look for highlights, share with the group, and then in a large group. Perfect. Kind of a think, pair, share grouping activity. It could take a lot of time to get through if every student looked at every document, so that's definitely a way to streamline and give them ownership. Each one can teach one, then you know what you have, so that's important. It also gives an opportunity to look at primary documents as well. If that's, I know for a lot of people that's goal or outcome that they must use within their classroom. Melissa says, call nonprofits that interest them and ask them if they have a specific need. They can group by interest topic. Absolutely. And you can easily do this now within the classrooms. You can use Skype or Google Hangouts, or even just put it on speakerphone and have all your students around it. And it's important for the student to make that call to build their communication skills. And, you know, as an adult, if a student calls me and needs something, I am much more likely to work with them or do whatever they need because they took the time to call me or reach out to me. So I'll share a few as well. Community mapping, which we have some resources on the GSN. If you just search community mapping, interviewing community members, and this is a great thing they can practice on each other before going out in the community. Doing a survey either of neighbors or people within their school, research through newspaper and online news sites, brainstorming together as a group, partnering with an organization that's been brought up, and then just a reminder, as Sarah kind of brought up as well, you could do a full class versus an individual investigation. Not everybody has to be investigating the same issue or reaching out to the same people as well. They could be doing their investigation and research on their own. So we're getting close to the end of the webinar. If you have any additional questions or want specific resources or want to make sure that your goal for attending this webinar is met, please send them through the chat box. But really to be thinking about within investigation, your outcomes should be that you have researched potential issues, you've gathered enough information to create a thorough plan. The planning is the next step, but you've gathered the information here. You find others who care about the issue so that you're not working in isolation. You've engaged in reflection activities or pre-reflection activities. You've determined a baseline to measure impact. So as a group, you've decided exactly what you want your service or your action to be. And as an educator, you've introduced the assessment that the students will be graded against so that they can keep that in mind as they approach their service learning project. If there is any other questions, please send them through now. We'll stay on the webinar for a while. I want to direct all of you to the GSN, our online network of youth and adults engaged in service learning. There is thousands upon thousands of resources within the GSN, over 600 user-generated projects. It's all free. We have the National Service Learning Clearinghouse, gsn@nylc.org. Marcus just sent that through, as well as if you have any individual questions, maybe you don't feel comfortable sharing through the chat box, but you want to talk to somebody or you're looking for a specific resource, reach out to gsn@nylc.org for that information. We'll stay on the webinar for a little bit, but please send any questions you have. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the GSN. You should receive a copy of this in your inbox in the next few days. Thank you. Have a great week.